'Tis hard to say if greater want of skill appear in writing or in judging ill, but of the two less dangerous is the offense to tire our patience than mislead our sense. Some few in that, but numbers err in this, 10 censor wrong for one who writes amiss. A fool might once himself alone expose, now one in verse makes many more in prose. 'Tis with our judgments as our watches none go just alike, yet each believes his own. In poets as true genius is but rare, true taste as seldom is the critic's share. Authors are partial to their wit, 'tis true, but are not critics to their judgment too?
Or so wrote Alexander Pope in his piece called An Essay on Criticism. Now, what did all that mean? Well, we'll definitely be getting into that, as it is the topic of this episode. Because today, Dave knows criticism. Writer Alexander Pope once wrote a criticism on criticism, and the point of the excerpt that I read in the beginning of the video was pointing out the dangers of criticism. And if you're following my comic book channel, and I hope that you are, you no doubt know my predilection for criticizing critics, especially with my show, Critical Mass. But with all that in consideration, why do people feel the need to criticize criticism of all things? Isn't that getting just a little too Inception for its own good? Well, to reiterate and to clarify Pope's sentiment, a writer who wants to write something good but ends up writing something awful really only hurts himself. But a critic, on the other hand, can influence many writers going forward. No one ever tries to emulate something bad, so if someone epic fails on something, the most damage that they're gonna do is done to themselves. But alternatively, when it comes to criticism, people tend to take that closer to heart. While a bad creator may end up with a small following, critics seem to get listened to much more than the content that they talk about. Just think about all the reviews for a movie that you listened to or read before seeing the actual film. That is, unless the criticism turned you off from seeing it altogether. Also, in some cases, people will hear out critics that they don't even agree with most of the time. They just listen to get an alternate take. So now, tying this all into pro wrestling, and to give an example, let's just say that you're a wrestler, a high-flying one at that, and there's a certain critic of yours that always says all you do is flippy stuff and that you can't actually wrestle. Now, you don't actually agree with this guy, but you decide to show him that he doesn't know what he's talking about, and you put on a match without any of your signature flips just to prove that you're more than a mere spot monkey. Well, that kind of influence on someone could be a problem that gets repeated many times over by people wanting to silence their critics, which is admirable to a degree, but still potentially problematic all the same. Oh, and keep in mind, that was just an example. This is not a critique for or against flips. I was just using that to illustrate a point. But continuing on, what makes this matter worse is that humans by nature just crave acceptance. We as a species learned a long time ago that we survive better as part of a group, and after generations upon generations all thriving off of acceptance, it's become hardwired into us to want to be accepted by other humans. So when a critic, a so-called expert, is offering high praise on your work, many will make attempts to get recognition from that critic. But to further the point of Alexander Pope, by being a creator, and yes, wrestlers are creators, you need to have creative freedom and flexibility to explore your craft in order to perfect and in order to offer a diverse, eclectic array of content. And sure, sometimes a critic can help guide a performer to greater heights, but it's all too often that they limit creators by insisting that there is one specific definition of what good is, and that one is either in that definition or they're not. Now, this doesn't just affect one individual creator, but also future members of an industry learn a lot about their industry from critics. So if a generation grows up reading the criticism that a specific something is good or is bad, it distinctly raises the probability of them agreeing with that statement, shaping how they perform and what they value, even though the original criticism is not objectively true. And what makes this scenario particularly dangerous is that our society has become one where way more reviews, recaps, scenarios, Facebook comments, tweets, and opinion polls are consumed than actual creations. Sure, that's perfectly understandable. Those are way easier and faster to take in than an entire piece of creative content. Plus, since Alexander Pope's essay on criticism was published way back in, 1711, this is also just human nature. It's not a new phenomenon or anything. The internet has just given us our latest platform to ingest criticism of other people's work, but to a much greater volume, because anyone can post on the internet and, well, everyone's a critic. Now, I'm not saying that there is anything wrong with getting the opinions of others, and with giving my critique on critiques, it would be pretty odd if I was. What I am saying is that we need to remember that other people's opinions are just that, opinions. And when we get bombarded by so many critics, I think we all benefit from reminders that by definition, opinions are not objective. They are not facts and they cannot be true or false, no matter what anyone claims. We must understand that there is absolutely no standardization for good. And we shouldn't get too worked up about anyone's opinion, one way or the other. To illustrate, allow me to bring up a name. Dave Meltzer. Now, some of you out there might have an instant reaction to just the mention of this guy's name, but whether it's extremely positive or extremely negative, it really shouldn't be extremely anything as far as I'm concerned. His opinion shouldn't be used as evidence to prove that a match is empirically good because good is subjective. It's not provable. However, for those of you who get angry because of how highly he rates particular matches, well, just remember it's really not worth the aggravation. There's no point in getting angry at someone over how they feel about a match. And if you claim to be mad because you don't like how his supporters put him on a pedestal, well, just know that's still getting angry because of the opinions of others, which again really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Being a supporter or being a defamer of a critic is perfectly fine, but it's not worth getting too heavily invested in, because if any one specific point of view becomes too dominant with everyone jumping on one particular bandwagon, it'll shape the industry to focus on that one specific outlook at the expense of others. For instance, if wrestling fans keep complaining that wrestlers aren't doing enough moves, then we could very well see a generation of wrestlers that do tons of moves but have placed less focus on things like storytelling. If wrestling fans keep complaining that wrestlers don't have enough character, then we might see plenty of matches with over-the-top gimmicks at the cost of real technical wrestling. If people keep complaining that wrestlers are too small, then we may get a full roster of steroid abusers at the risk of the wrestlers' own lives. What we need is a balance of all the different things that make wrestling great, and in order to get that, we also need a balance of criticism too. Allow me to close with this.
In many ways, the work of a critic is easy. We risk very little, yet enjoy a position over those who offer up their work and themselves to our judgment. We thrive on negative criticism, which is fun to write and to read, but the bitter truth we critics must face is that in the grand scheme of things, the average piece of junk is probably more meaningful than our criticism designating it so.
Wise words from Anton Ego from the movie Ratatouille. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, Dave knows.